What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So I recently finished playing through Fire Emblem The Binding Blade on hard mode for the first time, true ending included. I feel like I have a lot to say, not only about FE6 specifically, but also tangentially the other two Game Boy Advance Fire Emblems. Longtime viewers might remember I previously had a discussion up on the channel where I discussed my admittedly brief impressions of the GBA Fire Emblems, and while my general opinions of GBA Emblem haven't changed that much, I still wanted to make this video as somewhat of an excuse to discuss those opinions more deeply than I previously did, specifically within the context of FE6. But before I get too deep into things, I do want to hear from you guys in the comments as far as what your favorite Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem is. While each of the GBA Fire Emblems do have their differences, the core of the gameplay is very similar to the point where you could definitely argue that they provide similar experiences to one another. Perhaps barring Tower of Valney grinding in Sacred Stones, of course. Each individual system on its own is simple and easy to grasp, but when these systems are used in conjunction with one another, it can lead to situations with deep intricacies and synergies across these systems. And even if you could apply that sentiment to most of the other games in the series as well, I think that this simplicity in the GBA titles specifically is one of their greatest strengths. It's one factor that lends them to more of a pick up and play nature than some of the other titles in the series. For those of you who are able and interested in showing additional support towards me in the channel, since this is a one-man operation, I do have a Ko-fi page for direct donations as well as the myriad ways to show support through YouTube. Thank you to those who have shown support thus far, and thank you to everyone else for your consideration. Another notable factor that contributes to this pick-up and play nature of Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem is that the stories in these games aren't really the main driver to play them, in my opinion. I would be lying if I said I felt particularly invested in any of these stories. Of course, on a first run, I pay attention and I try to soak it all in, but it's not really something that I want to go out of my way to engage with on repeat playthroughs, which is something that I actually do go out of my way to do with games that have stories that resonate with me more. As I'm recording this, I'm prepping to replay the Tellius games, and I have every intention to pay close attention to those stories as much as my first playthrough. Of course, considering that with those games, the narrative elements are a greater percentage of the draw. I do really like how Roy, despite being young and inexperienced, is forced to lead an army in his father's stead due to various circumstances that happen in the early chapters. I also like that even when the story appears to be taking a detour closer to the mid-game, there's actually a narrative reasoning behind that. With that said, I feel like a lot of the plot revelations come with some implied level of significance, but was rarely anything that I ever felt particularly invested in or shocked by. This is due in part to some pretty dry dialogue, but it's also not like the other GBA titles are Shakespeare in comparison either. I would hazard a guess that this is indicative of a localization effort that is trying to be as literal of a translation as possible, even though I understand from a perspective of someone doing a fan translation that this would be the safest route to go, especially considering certain titles in this series have been heavily altered via localization. But I think a more significant factor that leads these stories to not feeling all that exciting or engaging is presentation limitations on the Game Boy Advance. I am mostly referring to the limitations on the narrative presentation in particular. I think something in the vein of Shadows of Valentia would be more than I could really ask for, as far as presenting this kind of story, because that game's story is relatively simple and predictable, not too unlike the GBA games, but that presentation with the voice acting and the character portraits that are able to express different emotions and stuff like that brings the characters and the world to life in a way that has me not caring as much about how deep or surprising the story may or may not be. While I'm not necessarily saying that I want or need or am expecting that the GBA titles will get remade at some point, I've just been thinking lately when it comes to remaking games that were originally pixel art, that something more in the vein of what Square Enix is doing with their HD 2D style makes more sense than trying to adapt titles that might not translate as well into full 3D. Now, as for the presentation outside of the narrative aspects, the pixel art is pretty great. The most important thing here is that it's very readable. It's very easy to look at any given Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem map and see, okay, that's a cluster of cavaliers, they all have 7 move, so I can safely move here, here, or here to stay out of range, etc. and so on. Class names and availability and stuff like that do differ from game to game, especially in the more recent titles. They've gotten more experimental, which I'm cool with. It just makes it harder, for me at least, to glance at a map and determine what exactly I'm looking at as far as the spread of units. And I think this is less so a fault of any particular particular game and just more so a benefit to using pixel art. And then of course I would be remiss to not mention the animation work here. The battle animations remain enjoyable to watch, even after seeing many of them hundreds of times at this point, if not more. And I think the most important thing is that they're really snappy. I didn't turn off battle animations at all during this playthrough, which certainly did pad out the runtime, but I think it's nice when you can justify watching these battle animations play out, not just for eye candy's sake, but also for sort of a layer of tension. Is my unit gonna dodge this 53%, or am I gonna crit this 30%, etc., and so on. And I don't feel like you get that as much when you turn battle animations off. I just think that in a lot of other Fire Emblems past this pixel art era, the battle animations tend to drag things to a more significant degree. And even so, you could certainly turn off the animations in these Game Boy Advance games if you are trying to speed things along, especially in instances where you're face tanking reinforcements or something. But yeah, I say that as someone who also intentionally did not use speed up at all during this playthrough. That's a tool that I try to use as minimally as I can justify. When it comes to turn-based games especially, I would just prefer that the animations be readable and snappy enough to where I don't feel pressured to use some kind of speed up function, whether that's something included in a re-release or via emulator or whatever. Definitely more to say on that when I get around to my Path of Radiance replay in particular. But for now, let's briefly move into the music, and yeah, this certainly is a Game Boy Advance OST. There's some catchy tunes here or there across these games, but there's not really much when it comes to the soundtracks of the GBA Fire Emblems that I feel super strongly about. It is mostly a GBA problem rather than it being a problem specifically with these games, but it's still something that, despite growing up with a Game Boy Advance back in the day, I've become less and less forgiving of that over time. Now, finally moving into the real meat of what I think is the main appeal of GBA Fire Emblem specifically, the gameplay. Now, I don't want to necessarily tout this as like the greatest gameplay of all time or anything. It is relatively simple, as I went into earlier, but similarly to what I said earlier about that simplicity, I think it lends itself to just a very pure and playable experience. And I don't mean that in the literal sense of like, oh, older titles are unplayable, whatever. I really just mean it's quick to understand and you can just jump in and start playing without much hassle. Now, of course, for those of you who don't have as much experience with these older Fire Emblem titles, I will note that it can get a little tedious checking enemy ranges because you can't permanently tag enemies. Specifically with enemy staff users, I had to kind of manually count out how many spaces away I could be to avoid them. But also, ultimately, the ranges on these staves tend to be so wide. It's more so who are they going to target and are they going to dodge, as opposed to being able to really reliably keep all of your units out of range. And of course, checking inventories can also be a little tedious as well. You can use the D-pad to scroll through them, but when you're scrolling through them, it's not always in an order that makes the most sense. Even with GBA limitations, I don't really see why it wouldn't have been possible to display inventories when you hover over a unit and just have a toggle to turn that on or off. It's not really the biggest deal because most enemies' inventories aren't that complex. The main things to watch out for are just effective weapons like a Horse Slayer, or ranged weapons like javelins or longbows, but those latter two examples show up when you check enemy ranges anyway. And then I think the most major difference between playing a lot of older Fire Emblem titles compared to recent entries is each unit has kind of an intended role for any given playthrough, and there's not really much you can do to change that. And then of course managing weapon durability as well, which is a much bigger deal here because you can't just restock between maps. You have to consider doing that while you're on any given map. Though to be fair, most maps stop spawning reinforcements once the boss is killed, which allows for pretty much the perfect opportunity to do your shopping. This also potentially gives you an opportunity to grind out supports. I don't want to talk about it too much because it's pretty well known that the support system in the GBA games is questionable. It just takes a ton of turns for units to build supports with one another. I'm also personally not a huge fan of limiting the number of support conversations a unit can have in any given playthrough. And of course, something I won't dig into in detail here is the support affinities, which basically indicate what stats get boosted and by how much for each given support a unit has. The main thing I want to say about this is I wish that the game actually told you about these or what they specifically do, though this is not the first or last time Fire Emblem will obscure useful information for seemingly no reason. There are definitely some similarities to modern Fire Emblem as well, in that your snowball units are still gonna snowball, but you can't get complacent. Some of my strongest units, including Rutger, died due to carelessness on my part. Now, Rutger in particular was an unfortunate case where I made a pretty stupid misplay very, very late on. I think it was the second to last map or something. So I had already more than got my value out of him as a unit, and I didn't need him to finish the game at that point. And that also goes for some other units that I lost. I made a major misplay with Marcus towards the end of chapter 7 and lost him there, but that's also the chapter where you're able to recruit Zealot, who is also a pre-promoted paladin. It worked out really nicely to where Zealot could kind of take over for where Marcus left off as far as his role in my army. I also did my best this playthrough to not reset maps as much, and part of that is trusting in the game design design as far as recruitable units popping up at a regular pace. That said, there are a number of recruitable units in this game that can only be recruited via talking to them with a specific other unit, which means that if you've lost that specific other unit, then you lose out on subsequent recruitments that have to do with them. The biggest one is that Noah can recruit Fear, who can then recruit Bartra depending on your Western Isles route split, and then Fear can way later on, if you're going for the true ending, recruit Corel. I want to say with Bartra you can recruit him with Roy as well, although I didn't get that split this time. I got the one where you get Echidna. And I guess I should at least mention the route splits, of which there are two in this game. The first of which that I just mentioned being in the Western Isles, and this is based on which of the villages you do or do not visit in the top right corner of Chapter 9's map. But this route split is definitely less significant than the one later on in the game, which is determined by whether your Pegasus Knights or Nomads have gained more experience cumulatively. So if your Pegasus Knights have gained more EXP up to that point, you go to Ilia, which is notably the more manageable and I would say traditional of the two splits as far as the map design is concerned there. And that's the split that I intentionally went for this time because the playthrough that I didn't finish, which I discussed in my older GBA Fire Emblem video, I had gotten the Sakai route split because I unfortunately lost my Pegasus Knights early on, and subsequently the Nomads ended up gaining more experience from that. This time around the opposite kind of happened, which was preferable for me just because I seem to recall the Sakai maps just sort of dragging on. It takes place on these Great Plains, but I just don't think that that lends itself to the most interesting map design or gameplay experience in this game's case in particular, where I feel like the strengths tend to lie in more dense map design. I would deploy some units with the intention to maybe get some value out of them, but I wasn't really expecting them to do all that well, and if they happened to die or if I needed to sacrifice them for the sake of pressing on, I would. But more so, I kind of took it as the game punishing me for my mistakes, which I think is something that does get lost in newer Fire Emblem titles. I've mentioned it before where I think that Rewind can be a good learning tool, but at the same time, it does clearly alter the way that Intelligent Systems approaches the design of the games. Because even in the games with Rewind where it is possible to beat them without using it, on whatever difficulty it might be feasible, those aren't games that are designed with that in mind. One could argue Shadows of Valentia is because the maps are so faithful to the original, so the Rewind is just kind of like a bonus safety net on top of a game that was designed without it in mind to begin with. But for Three Houses and Engage, it feels like such an integral part of the design. Now, whether or not you like or dislike that aspect is going to be a matter of preference for sure, but I just think something is lost when you can, with the press of a button, undo a mistake that would have costed you. But again, the problem with rolling with that mistake is that you're not really given units at a regular pace to replace ones that may have fallen. Now, that's not to say it's all sunshine and rainbows in FE6. There's definitely some things that people consider to be BS, such as ambush spawns or same-turn reinforcements, whatever you want to call them. And yeah, this is a mechanic that I am not a huge fan of. However, barring maybe a few exceptions, I think that the hatred for FE6's same-turn reinforcements in particular is overblown. Because 9 times out of 10, reinforcements will either spawn from where you started on the map, from staircases, and potentially from places where the map might lead off-screen. Now, there is one exception to this that I'm recalling. I think it's in Chapter 21, where there are paladins that spawn from above a mountain range, which is the only instance I can think of reinforcements that shouldn't be able to traverse said terrain, but are still presented as kind of appearing from around there. Another aspect that people point to with FE6 as far as BS is low hit rates on a lot of the weapons. And yes, this is very apparent, particularly with axes, to the point where I went out of my way to not use axe users as much as possible because of how unreliable they are. And so this leads to swords being the most reliable weapon type, which leads me into how you might be able to play around some of this BS and RNG. You know, I already expressed that the ambush reinforcements are generally pretty easy to predict if you play like more than a handful of maps. They're definitely BS in some cases, but they're BS in cases where I'm not going to forget that kind of stuff on subsequent playthroughs, such as the throne room in Chapter 6. And then as far as the low hit rates, it's just kind of playing to the odds. This is not to say that I didn't miss crucial attacks that I needed to land, but in those instances, more often than not, I was getting greedy as far as EXP distribution as opposed to safely trying to eliminate threats. I think there are a number of ways that you can play around this kind of RNG, even though I think the low hit rates on axes in particular are overkill. Having weapons that can attack up close and at range, like javelins and hand axes, are by and large the best options post FE6, and they're still powerful here. It's just that the accuracy is definitely on the lower side, so you can't rely on it as much. And I think that if you've built up certain habits from playing other Fire Emblems where there is less of a disparity between the weapon types, I could see it being easy to fall into the trap of trying to rely on strategies that do work in other games but not here. Even in that initial GBA Fire Emblem video I did a few years ago, I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but FE6 was a title that felt the most compelling to me, especially in the early game, even on normal mode. I think part of of that is, now having played it on hard mode, that this game pushes you from the very beginning. And it pushes you, once again, into playstyles that, if coming from other Fire Emblems, might not feel particularly natural or preferable. And one major aspect is early game Marcus. So Marcus is your Jagan in FE6. And for those who don't know what a Jagan is, it's a unit archetype that is in most, if not all, Fire Emblem titles, where you have an early game pre-promoted unit who more often than not falls off stat-wise as you progress through the game. So they're really there to make the early game more manageable. And with FE6 Marcus on hard mode in the early maps, more often than not deals just enough damage to enemy units without killing them, which then allows for your weaker starting units to secure those kills and reap the rewards of their higher EXP gains. And I think it's also great that Marcus is a unit that does fall off compared to his FE7 self, as well as Seth in Sacred Stones. Those two units, especially Seth, can continue to be powerful throughout the entire game's runtime to a point where it's kind of silly in my opinion. The first 7 chapters of this game can be really brutal, and while there are difficult maps past then, there is a little bit of a reprieve from, I would say, chapter 8 to like chapter 11 or something like that. And that also makes sense narratively too, because you're going from being at a disadvantage to the invading army of Burn to dealing with bandits in the Western Isles. It makes sense, and it kind of allows you to, once you've pushed through this very difficult early game, take a step back, analyze who's still alive, who's worth investing in, etc. I sort of view rescue dropping as being the glue that holds this game together. Of course, this was introduced in Thracia 776 alongside Capture, which does not return here. I do think Marcus is particularly suited to this task early on because of his relatively higher stats, allowing him to rescue units that Alan and Lance might not be able to, as well as having that additional point of move. And of course, in certain circumstances, he might actually be able to handle a round of combat while holding onto somebody, despite the stat decreases from that. Another factor that leads to rescue being such a pivotal mechanic here is because the objective for pretty much all the maps in this game are for Roy to seize the throne. And I know a lot of people see this or hear about this and they roll their eyes and it's like, oh, it's so boring that the objective is the same for every single map. I actually think seize is a good objective. I much prefer it to rout, and I think that while you can cheese seize maps similar to defeat boss maps, having to take that extra step of the Lord seizing the throne after beating a boss is kind of inherently more interesting than just defeating the boss. This leads to the big rhetorical question regarding the game design in FE6, which is, what is the goal? The goal is to get Roy to the throne and seize the throne. And this is further accentuated by the ambush reinforcements pushing you to move faster, by the way that rescue dropping works, by the way that the warp staff works, etc. and so on. The game gives you these tools to serve the goal of getting Roy to the throne to seize it. And what can make this difficult is that Roy kind of sucks ass in combat. Even once he gets promoted and gets access to the titular binding blade, unless he was fighting a dragon specifically, his combat was still kind of ass. The way in which you can approach seize maps just gives you a lot of options, and you couple that with the higher difficulty, especially in the early game, which of course then brings in all the permadeath things that I mentioned and all the mechanical things as well. And that leads to what causes most of the variance from playthrough to playthrough. The variance doesn't come from character building, but it comes from sort of the brutality of the map design here. And I find this to be way more compelling than FE7 and FE8's early game specifically. If you're replaying FE7, you can technically skip Lin mode, so you'll be missing out on the EXP there, but Lin mode in FE7 is just like so simple and not really something that I've ever enjoyed. It's the thing that put me off from playing the game all the way through for so long. Not to say that it's completely intolerable, but if you've played a Fire Emblem game before, I feel like you should at least download a save that gives you access to Lin hard mode so you can skip the tutorial kinds of things. And then especially so with Sacred Stones, where I don't necessarily have a problem with the game being on the easier side, but Sacred Stones hard mode, especially in the early game, feels so predictable and just kind of like I'm going through the motions in a way that I don't feel whenever I've restarted FE6. Each time there does end up being variance because of the various game design decisions that were made when making this game. For better or worse, whatever, it to me provides a more compelling experience on a replay especially. Something I would recommend you consider that you don't necessarily have to is the various side objectives. If you see chests on a map, bring a thief. And thieves also kind of suck in combat, so they are more so there for the utility of being able to open chests and also steal non-weapons from any unit, regardless of stats. If you see villages on the map, you probably want to bring higher movement units, but especially so on those maps where you have brigands that will destroy the villages if you're too slow. And these types of things provide an extra layer of depth that, while not totally necessary, will definitely help you if you go out of your way to acquire these extra items and all of that. If you see shortcuts you could potentially take to any of these side objectives or even the throne itself, you might want to bring a couple of flyers if you have them at your disposal to rescue drop your more powerful combat units over said wall or over said gap. And so there's all sorts of things to consider as far as who you're deploying for not just combat purposes. Now, the last thing I want to mention, as far as the maps is that while I do generally enjoy the map design in this game for the reasons that I mentioned, I do find the guide-in chapters, which are required to get the true ending, to be kind of boring. In order to unlock these guide-in chapters, you typically have to keep whatever units you just recruited on said map alive, and oftentimes complete the map in under a certain number of turns. The guide-in chapters themselves, once you've fulfilled the criteria and unlock them, each of them has some kind of gimmick. Once you see these things activate once, it's pretty easy to tell when they're going to activate, maybe barring the disappearing platforms. I can't really tell you how that functions exactly because that's the first guide-in chapter that you can warp skip. Despite them having gimmicks that you would think would make them more interesting, I just kind of found them to not be so much. If you complete all these guide-in chapters, as well as keep all of the legendary weapons that you acquire from said guide-in chapters intact, once you complete what normally would be the last chapter, you unlock a few extra chapters and a more conclusive ending to the story as well. Even though I stated earlier that the story in this game is really not something that I felt super invested in, it was still nice to see it all the way through and have something that is more conclusive than how it would have been without going for the true ending. This is also not all to say that FE6 is suddenly my favorite Fire Emblem game or anything like that, but it is very likely to be my go-to among the more pick up and play entries, which means it probably would cut my top 5 by virtue of filling that role for me in this series. But ultimately, I tend to be drawn more into the titles that focus more on their narrative, which is why I'm very excited for my aforementioned replay of the Tellius duology, which will then in turn allow me to make dedicated videos on both Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, on top of getting to enjoy playing through those games again on harder difficulties this time for sure, since I am much more experienced and I think much better at Fire Emblem than I was those few years ago, though there is certainly still room for improvement in my playstyle, which is also kind of exciting in its own right. I of course want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe of course if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.